Hi, I'm Penny Grubb, and I've been given a question about my crime series. Question is, what's the role of the weather in your novels? First thing that struck me when I heard this one was, I'm UK based, we don't have weather. We talk about it all the time, but it's just like saying hello, nice day, warmer today. Although, of course, with climate change, that is changing. It is kind of turning into, did you ship any damage from that gale? How did that storm affect you, and so on? But in my novels, my first thought was, it doesn't really affect things. But interestingly, when I checked, there is more weather than I thought. Now, I don't date my books to a particular year, although each one is set in a particular year. And you could, if you look closely enough and follow the clues, you could work out which year each one is tied to. I tell a lie, there is one, Syrup Trap City, which is actually dated explicitly. It starts at the end of 2016 in the run-up to the City of Culture year for the City of Hull, where I used to work. I wanted it to be published in that City of Culture year, as well as being set in that year, which meant, of course, that I was writing it in 2015-16. And to be honest, praying that nothing was going to happen to derail the plot. Not that I thought of it at the time, but like, for instance, a global pandemic. But that was a bullet I dodged by only a few years. But one of the things I was checking was advanced weather forecasts, particularly winter weather. Were there going to be particular traffic disruptions, floods, that kind of thing? Because that was actually set in the centre of Hull, where winter weather actually does take its toll at times. The major settings in my books are real. So Syrup Trap City obviously is right there, bang in the middle of Hull. I do like the books to echo off the major news stories of the day. So here is Annie of Syrup Trap City. It's New Year's Eve, 2016. Let me just find that. The taxi driver was monosyllabic. Maybe he hadn't wanted to work New Year's Eve. Hard luck, thought Annie, I'm not overjoyed either. The 60-minute ride out of town and across open country went by in silence. As they arrived at an imposing gateway and sweeping drive, Annie thought of Leah Sleeman, the woman whose yoke Pat and Barbara were keen to escape. Leah lived in a remote place like this, long driveway, house hidden behind the trees. But the similarities were superficial. None of Leah's alleged millions was apparent in the run-down, shabby front her house showed to the world, with its unkempt hedges and mismatched timbers. Here, a row of lights swept them round the curve of the driveway, discreet illumination emphasising the pristine stonework and mullioned windows. The edges of a manicured lawn peeped out from under the cold, hard frost. This place reeked of money. The weather doesn't drive my books in the sense of climate change overtly, I don't think. But it has often been really important. I mean, take the very first one. Like False Money, the weather plays a huge role. It's a really key part of the final sequence. The storm is almost a character in the book. Annie's out in it. There's a young girl out too. The young girl is far too ill to be out anywhere, let alone in the middle of a storm. And no one's going to believe that it wasn't Annie who persuaded her to come out. But when I look back, that storm must have been building for at least the final third of the book. And everything kind of spirals in on one lightning strike. It lights up an area of heathland, and it is kind of the trigger for the final reckoning of the book. I really never saw it that way when I wrote it. It's interesting. So this is an extract. This is Falling into Crime. It's the re-released trilogy with the first 3 books in. This is an extract from before the storms reached its height, and the girl that Annie's with here is not the one who's ill. Laura seemed paralysed, as though shock had switched her to a different dimension. Oh, his saddle's all wet. He's soaked. Laura reached into her pocket for a hanky to dab at the wet leather. For God's sake, get on his back! Annie rushed at Laura and lifted her at the pony, half throwing her onto it. Go on, get going! Even once aboard, Laura couldn't seem to grab the urgency above the niceties of arranging herself in the saddle and untwisting the reins. Careless of the danger from hoofs or teeth, Annie grabbed a handful of leather strapping somewhere near Boxer's nose and dragged him round to face the way out of the enclosure. Then she dived behind him and slapped his rump with all the energy she could muster. Almost crying in frustration as the rain stung her face and the wind cut through to her skin, Annie hit out again and again. The pony ambled across the concrete, with Laura crooning, "Boxer, you're safe, poor Boxer." Then through the rush and roar of the storm and the waves lashing the shore, Annie heard a tiny sound from somewhere nearby, like the snapping of a twig in the darkness beyond the wall. Now that's 2 books set in winter. Book 1 and Book 7. Is it a theme? Am I a winter writer? I did have a wondered for a moment, but it turns out not. Books 2 and 3 are both summer books. And the hot weather shapes a lot of what happens. In the Jawbone Gang, which is also part of Like False Money, Annie walks everywhere because she's broke. In The Dollmakers, she has to nurse an old jalopy from London to Glasgow. It doesn't like hot weather. It overheats. We know from early on that she doesn't want to risk it over the mountain passes, but there comes a point where she's cornered. That's the American edition of The Dollmakers. Interestingly, wrong way to Scotland. But never mind. A sudden glare of headlights blinded her. Her gasp was involuntary. She scrabbled with the wheel, throwing a hand up instinctively to shield her eyes. Her wrist hit painfully on the mirror. At once the light vanished. The road ahead was empty, dark. It cut away from her round the rock face. She struggled to keep control. The sounds of an engine revving hard didn't match what her feet were doing. The car scraped and juddered as it grated against the barrier. She fought to hold it to the road. A view flashed across her peripheral vision, the bold stripe of the barrier, and then nothing. A dense grey mist. No sign of the patchwork landscape far below. Her teeth clenched tight. She tasted blood as she accelerated out of the corner. The car rocked and steadied onto a short straight. Now she was off the killer climb, just the gentle undulations across the top of the pass, between her and the safety of the downward slope. But no more barriers. The gale hit as she stamped the pedal down again, bouncing along the thin tarmac strip that snaked across the summit. Out of the tree's cover, the storm smacked the car hard, as though the wind would pick it up and hurl it over the edge. So yes, the weather's there in every book. Where there's smoke, that's also the American edition. It's a lovely picture, but it's not the East Yorkshire coast, which is where that book actually plays out. Buried deep, again, better actually. I'd say that there is quite North Yorkshire to that one. Yeah, Buried Deep ranged from a gruesome find in a North Yorkshire field to a conference centre near Zurich under several feet of snow. Now, Tiger Blood had a huge range to cover, so the crimes were layered and went back through the generations. And it turned into a massive book, which it's not quite what I expected it to do. Actually, Tiger Blood also had a key scene that played out in a storm, so maybe it's storms that are my theme. Now the new one, Book 8, Boxed In, this one, starts on a cold winter evening in a yard full of shipping containers. One of the containers shouldn't be there, which is really odd because these things are enormous. They don't move on their own. You can't smuggle them in under your jacket. When I looked at this one again, sort of through the lens of the weather, as it were, I saw a bit of an echo to the Dollmakers. Back then, Annie had an old car that wasn't up to the job. Now things have changed, really changed. She's successful, money's not an issue. But of course, a good, reliable car isn't always going to help. There was a time she could really have done with one, but here, well, she's been unceremoniously dumped in the middle of nowhere. The only person with her is an injured woman who's unconscious, so she has no car in this moment. She has no phone, she doesn't even have any shoes. It is the middle of nowhere, but she's within a restricted perimeter, so she's going to be in big trouble, big, enormous trouble, if the wrong person captures her. Boxed in. Right, boxed in. Okay. As soon as he'd gone, she was on her feet, sprinting across the road, staring desperately into the darkness for any sign of the car, but it had disappeared. The sudden swell of sound of a vehicle approaching fast from the wrong direction had her dashing back to the muddy ditch beside the unconscious woman. She recognised the man in the car as it raced up to the junction. He took the corner without stopping. Her options had spiralled down, a stark choice. Wait for the security car to come round again and flag it down? How else would she get the help she needed? The wind whistled across the open countryside, chilling her to immobility. It wouldn't just be the woman in the ditch who would die out here if she didn't act. So yes, the weather. In Boxed In, it's the chill of winter that runs through the whole of the story. You know those days where the sun barely seems to make it over the horizon? And when it does, it's massively bright and really, really cold. Those days where you arrive at work in slightly damp clothes. Or where you go out and find yourself in a big drafty pub that just never warms up. Or you go quite the other direction, where you find yourself in a room where someone's turned the heating right up and you're all wrapped up in your winter clothes, so you go from freezing cold to baking hot. When I look back over my notes, I found I'd kept weather charts for most of the book. Phases of the moon I got records of key news stories and actual weather charts. So yes, turns out it was a really good question. And the answer really took me by surprise.